Martha Crowley moved through Red Creek like she owned the air itself. On a Tuesday morning in late June, she planted herself in the center of Dawson's General Store, where four women had gathered to sort through bolts of cotton fabric, and she opened her mouth with the kind of calm that meant damage was coming. "That schoolteacher from Illinois," Martha said, setting her basket down on the counter with a deliberate click. "The one staying at Clara Webb's place. I saw her ride out to Silas Granger's ranch again yesterday. Alone. At dusk." She let the silence sit. A grieving young girl, barely past 20, and a man old enough to be her father. Someone ought to put a stop to it before something happens she can't take back. Nobody disagreed. In Red Creek, nobody ever disagreed with Martha Crowley out loud. What none of them knew, what Martha herself had no interest in knowing, was that the story she was already writing in her head had almost nothing to do with the truth. If this kind of story moves something in you, the kind where real people make real mistakes and love shows up in the last place anyone expected, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to the beginning, before the gossip started, before the fire, before the locked door finally opened, and find out how a woman from Illinois ended up losing her heart in Wyoming. Adeline Mercer had not planned to fall in love with anything about Wyoming. She had planned to spend one summer, 60, maybe 90 days at the most, long enough to help her Aunt Clara recover from the fall that had cracked 2 ribs and left her unable to carry her own grocery basket, long enough to feel like a decent person, and then back to Illinois where a teaching position waited, where her father had already arranged her life into a shape he found acceptable, and where the world made the kind of orderly sense Adeline had decided she could live with. That was the plan. She had written it out in a letter to her father before boarding the train, and Thomas Mercer had written back approving every sentence. The train into Red Creek arrived 40 minutes late on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of June. Adeline stepped off onto the platform with one large trunk, one smaller bag, and the particular expression of a person who has been traveling for 2 days and slept badly for most of them. Her hair had come loose on one side. She had a smear of something on her left sleeve she hadn't noticed yet. The platform was dusty and the wind came sideways, which nobody had warned her about. Her Aunt Clara was waiting with a wagon, sitting up on the seat with a careful posture that said her ribs still hurt, and she was pretending otherwise. "You look exhausted," Clara said, by way of greeting. "I look exactly how I feel," Adeline said, and climbed up beside her. "How are your ribs?" "Fine." "They're not fine." "No," Clara admitted. "They're not, but they're better than they were, and I'm grateful you came." That was the beginning of it. Not a dramatic beginning. No thunderstorm, no mysterious stranger, no sense that anything was about to change. Just a dusty platform and 2 women being honest with each other, which was already more than Adeline got at home. Clara Webb's house sat at the edge of town on a lot surrounded by a garden that had grown considerably more wild than intentional during the weeks her aunt had been unable to manage it. Adeline spent her first 2 days pulling weeds, hauling water, and relearning how to sleep through wind instead of city noise. On the 3rd morning, she walked the length of the main street just to understand what she was working with. Red Creek was not a large town. One general store, a post office, a livery, a small hotel that doubled as the town's only dining room, a barbershop, and a church whose paint was peeling in long strips down the front. Maybe 300 people, more in the surrounding ranching country. Everyone looked at her the way people look at someone new. Not hostile exactly, just measuring. She bought thread and a tin of salve at Dawson's General Store and exchanged exactly 14 words with the woman at the counter before a voice behind her said, "You're Clara Webb's niece." It wasn't a question. Adeline turned. The woman was somewhere in her 60s with silver hair pinned very precisely and the posture of someone who had decided decades ago that she was the most important person in any room she entered. She was dressed carefully, expensively for a town this size, and she was looking at Adeline with an expression that was almost warm, which somehow made it less trustworthy than if it had been cold. "Martha Crowley," the woman said, extending her hand. "I've known your aunt 20 years. She didn't tell me you were so young." "I'm 24, Adeline said. "Of course you are." Martha smiled. "Are you settled in? Is there anything you need? The town likes to take care of its own, and since you're here for Clara, we consider you one of ours. It was generously said. Adeline thanked her, finished her purchase, and walked back out into the wind with a feeling she couldn't entirely name, something between warmth and a warning she hadn't received yet. She didn't see Silas Granger for 4 more days. When she did, it was by accident, the way most things that matter tend to happen. Clara had sent her to pick up a sack of flour and 2 pounds of dried beans from Dawson's, and on the way back she turned a corner she'd taken twice before and walked directly into the side of a man carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder and a paper-wrapped parcel under his other arm. The flour survived. One of the beans bags split at the seam, which was a problem. "I'm sorry," said the man, and he was already crouching to help before he finished the sentence, gathering up the beans with the practical efficiency of someone who has dealt with spilled things before and doesn't see any reason to spend time being embarrassed about it. Adeline crouched too. "It's fine. I wasn't watching where I was going." Neither was I. They worked in silence for a moment, picking beans off the dusty ground with the particular focus of people who aren't sure yet whether to be awkward or just practical. He was older. She noticed that first, not unkindly, just as a fact. His hands were rough in the way that comes from decades of actual work, not occasional effort. His face had the deep-set lines of someone who spent most of his time outside, and his eyes, when he glanced up, were a quieter color than she expected. Gray-green, like water under cloud cover. "Silas Granger," he said. "Adeline Mercer. I'm staying with my aunt." "Clara Webb." He nodded once. "She mentioned you were coming, said you were a school teacher." "I am." He said nothing to that. Not dismissive, sure, more like he was actually thinking about it. He handed her the gathered beans in a cupped palm, and she transferred them into the split bag held carefully shut. They both stood. "The bag won't hold," he said, looking at the seam. "You've got maybe 3 blocks before it gives entirely." "I know." She looked at it with the expression of a person solving a small problem. "I'll hold it from underneath. Or I could carry it." She looked at him. He wasn't being gallant, or if he was doing it in such a matter-of-fact way that it didn't feel like performance. He just looked like a man who had identified the practical solution and was offering it without decoration. "All right," she said. They walked back toward Clara's house, and he carried the split bean bag from underneath without a word. She carried the flour. The wind came sideways, as it always did, and she kept having to put a hand up to keep her hair from crossing her face. "Does the wind ever stop?" she asked. "Not really," he said. "You get used to it." "My aunt's been here 15 years and she still makes a face every time it gusts." "Clara makes a face at a lot of things," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost amused, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "She's also one of the most decent people I know, so I don't hold it against her." Adeline glanced sideways at him. "You sound like you mean that." "I do," he said simply. At Clara's gate, he handed her the beans with both hands, a careful transfer, and touched the brim of his hat before turning to walk back the way they'd come. He didn't look back. He didn't say it was nice to meet her or offer any of the standard pleasantries that people use to fill space. He just went, as if conversation were a thing you either had or didn't, and required no ceremony at either end. Adeline stood at the gate for a moment, holding the beanbag from underneath, and couldn't explain why she watched until he turned the corner. Inside, she told her aunt she'd run into Silas Granger. Clara's expression did something complicated. "He help you?" "He carried the beans, the bag split." "He would." Clara shifted carefully in her chair. "Good man, Silas. Quiet. People don't always know what to do with quiet." "He seems all right." "He is all right. More than all right." She paused. "He's also had more grief than one person ought to carry, and he carries it alone, which makes it worse." Adeline waited, because with her aunt, waiting usually brought more than asking. But Clara only said, "The beans need to be used today if they're going to be used at all." So that was the end of that conversation. She saw him again 6 days later, this time not by accident. Clara had asked her to return a book she'd borrowed from Silas. A thick volume on soil management that seemed an odd thing to borrow, but Clara had her reasons for everything. "Just leave it at the porch if he's not there," she said. "The ranch is about 2 miles out. Follow the creek north until you hit the cottonwoods, then west." Adeline went on foot because the morning was cool and she'd been spending too much time indoors. She found the ranch without difficulty. It sat in a wide hollow with the creek running along its eastern edge, a long, low house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, fencing that went farther than she could see. It was not fancy, but it was solid in a way that spoke of years of careful attention, not money. She was halfway across the yard when a horse she hadn't noticed exploded out of the nearest corral gate, a big roan, moving hard, dragging a broken section of fence rail by one rear leg where the rope had tangled wrong. The horse was terrified, and that made it dangerous. It was also headed directly toward the second barn, where she could hear other horses reacting to the commotion. Adeline did not know horses well. She knew enough to understand that what she was watching was going to get much worse very quickly. Then Silas came out of the barn at a dead run. Not panicked, nothing about him suggested panic, but fast and deliberate the way a person moves when they've been trained by necessity to think while their body is already moving. He cut the angle, got in front of the roan rather than chasing it, and did something with his voice that she couldn't quite describe. Not yelling, not soothing exactly, just a sound that had authority in it, steady and low. The horse slowed. Didn't stop, but slowed. He got a hand on the halter and the roan pulled hard and he let it, didn't fight it, moved with the pull, kept his grip, and talked to the animal in that same low voice until the horse's legs stopped driving forward and it stood blowing hard with its sides heaving and the broken rail dragging in the dirt behind it. It took another 10 minutes to untangle the rope without spooking the horse further, and Adeline stood very still at the edge of the yard and watched, because she had the sense that moving or speaking would be the wrong thing, and she was right. When it was done, Silas walked the horse back into the corral, latched it carefully, and turned around. He registered her presence without visible surprise. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I brought Clara's book back." She held it up, feeling slightly ridiculous. "She said to leave it on the porch. I saw you standing there. I didn't want to. I didn't know if I should." She stopped. That was something to watch. He looked at the roan still circling the corral. Old fence rail had been weakening for a week. I kept meaning to replace it. He said it flatly, the way you admit something when there's no point in pretending. "My fault. The horse is all right?" "Scraped, not serious." He turned back toward her. "You stayed still. That was the right call. A lot of people would have run or yelled. You seemed like you knew what you were doing." "Mostly," he said, the almost smile again. She set the book on the porch railing and they stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a situation that has just resolved itself. The creek ran somewhere nearby. One of the barn horses stamped and settled. "You want coffee?" he asked. "It's already made." She didn't particularly want coffee. She said yes anyway. They sat on the porch because the morning was still cool, and he brought 2 cups and they drank them without a great deal of conversation, which was unusual in Adeline's experience. Most people filled silence because they were uncomfortable in it. Silas Granger seemed to simply live in it. The way a person lives in a room, they know well enough not to need to look around. After a while, she asked, "How long have you had this place?" 22 years? He said it without particular feeling, which itself was a kind of feeling. Started with the north pasture, built up from there. Alone? Mostly. He turned his cup in his hands. Had a foreman for a while. A couple of hands some seasons. But, he paused, it's easier to depend on yourself. She understood, from the way he said it, that easier was not the same as good. "My aunt says you've had grief," she said, and immediately felt the bluntness of it. Clara had a way of talking about people that made certain things feel like common knowledge. But Adeline had only just met this man. He looked at her, not offended, more like measuring whether this was a real question or a conversational habit. "Everyone has grief," he said finally. "That's true," she said, but she meant something specific. He looked out toward the creek. The silence was longer this time, long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. "Yeah," he said. "She did." Then nothing more. Adeline finished her coffee and stood up. "Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for returning the book." He stood too because he was the kind of man who stood when someone else did. She walked back across the yard and followed the creek south toward town. She was nearly to the cottonwoods when she heard him call out, not loudly. The wind was coming sideways and she might have missed it. "Miss Mercer." She turned. He was still standing at the porch rail, cup in hand, 40 yards away. "The fence rail in the east pasture is also weakening," he called. "I'll need to work on it Saturday. If you wanted to come out again, there's usually coffee. She thought about the book she didn't need to borrow and the obvious nature of what was being offered, and said, "All right." She walked back to town with the wind in her face and tried to figure out when exactly she had agreed to do something she hadn't planned. The thing about Red Creek was that it watched. It watched the way small places watch. Not cruelly, not always, but comprehensively. Nothing moved without being noted, and nothing was noted without being discussed, and nothing was discussed without being shaped into a story, whether the shape was accurate or not. By the second week of July, people had noticed that Clara Webb's niece was riding out to the Granger Ranch twice a week. By the third week, they had stopped calling her Clara Webb's niece and started calling her the schoolteacher from Illinois, which meant she had moved from protected by association to judged on her own terms. By the fourth week, Martha Crowley had opinions. Adeline didn't know about the opinions at first. She only knew what she was experiencing, which was that she had started to look forward to Saturdays the way she had previously only looked forward to the end of a difficult work week. Silas taught her things. Not in a formal way. He wasn't a teacher and didn't pretend to be. But in the way a person teaches when they simply do something correctly and let you watch until you can do it too. He showed her how to check a horse's feet for stones, how to read the direction of a storm from the shape of the clouds building over the western ridge, how to splice a broken fence wire so it held instead of just appearing to hold. "Pull it tighter," he told her one morning, standing a foot behind her while she worked at the splice. "You're trying to be gentle with it. Wire doesn't need gentle. It needs the right tension." "I'm not being gentle," she said. "I just don't want to snap it." "If it snaps with what you're giving it, it would have snapped next week in the cold. Better to know now." He reached past her, one arm over her right shoulder, and adjusted the tension with his hands, a brief and completely practical contact, and then stepped back. "Now it'll hold." She tested it with a tug, and it held. "All right," she said, and couldn't entirely explain why she felt the heat in her face. They worked in silence for another hour. The sun moved. A hawk crossed the sky overhead 4 times, which she noticed and he didn't bother to point out because he'd long since stopped noticing hawks. On the ride back, she had borrowed one of his slower horses for these trips, a reliable mare named Dust. She thought about what Clara had said the night before when Adeline had mentioned she was going out to the Granger Ranch again. "People are talking," Clara had said very carefully. "People are always talking," Adeline said. "That's what small towns do." Not always harmlessly. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Martha Crowley said something to me at the market yesterday." "What did she say?" "That she was concerned. That you were a young woman still in mourning for your mother, and that it wasn't appropriate for Silas to be," she used the word, "cultivating your company." Adeline had set down her cup with more force than she intended. "Cultivating." "That's what she said." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that my niece was a grown woman with a functioning mind, and that Silas Granger was the most decent man in this county, and that concern which shows up looking that much like control tends to be mostly the second thing and not the first." Clara paused. "She wasn't happy with me." "She's not going to stop." "No," Clara agreed. "She's not." Adeline thought about that now, riding back along the creek on the quiet mare, the late afternoon making everything gold. The irritation was real, but there was also something else underneath it. Something closer to the feeling of someone looking at a map and realizing the route she'd been so certain about was not, actually, the only route available. She had a letter from her father waiting at the house when she got back. She read it at the kitchen table while her aunt made tea. Her father's letters were always organized. He was a man who believed in structure. This one covered, in order, the condition of the house in their absence, the status of the teaching position being held for her at the end of summer, and in paragraph 3, where he placed the things he considered most important, a reminder that her purpose in Wyoming was recovery and assistance, not distraction. He had written the word distraction with the underline of a man who believed meaning could be added through emphasis. She folded the letter, set it on the table, and looked at it for a moment. "Tea," her aunt said. "Please," said Adeline. She didn't answer her father's letter for 3 days, which was unusual for her. She spent those 3 days being honest with herself, which was harder than the fence work. She was not grieving the way her father believed she was grieving. Her mother had died 14 months ago, not suddenly, but after a long decline that had given all of them time to say what needed saying. The grief was real, but it was not acute. What she felt in Wyoming was not the temporary lightness of escape. It was something more uncomfortable than that. She felt like herself. And she was beginning to suspect she had not felt like herself in a very long time. It was on the first Saturday of August that she found the door. She had come out earlier than usual because Silas had mentioned needing help moving fence posts in the northern pasture, and she'd arrived before he was back from checking the east water line. The door to the house was unlocked. He always left it unlocked, she'd learned, because in 22 years alone he'd never developed the habit of locking things. She went inside to leave the bread she'd brought from Clara's kitchen. The house was spare. A main room with a table, 2 chairs, a stove, shelves of useful things, one bedroom door standing open, a second door, at the end of the short hall, that was closed. She hadn't noticed it before. She had no particular reason to notice it now except that the house was tidy and practical and everything in it had an obvious purpose, and this door was the only thing that looked like it was being kept apart from everything else. There was a key in the lock, but it was turned, and the key was worn to a color that said it had been a long time since anyone used it. She didn't try to open it. She set the bread on the table and went back outside. But when Silas returned an hour later and they were having coffee, she found herself looking at the hallway and then back at him. "That second door," she said. He followed her eyes. Said nothing. "I noticed it," she said. I'm not asking you to explain it." "Good," he said, not unkindly, but completely closed. She let it go. She let it go for 17 more days, in fact, and she would have let it go longer, but on the 19th day something happened that made the door matter in a way she hadn't anticipated. 3 ranchers she'd met only briefly, men who worked land south of town and who had always greeted her in the street with the careful politeness of people who weren't sure what to make of her, stopped her on the main street on a Wednesday afternoon and asked her, with a seriousness that didn't fit the casual setting, whether she was all right. She said she was. "Because people get concerned," said the one named Holt, who had a red beard and spoke like he was choosing words from a limited supply. "Silas Granger's a good rancher, but some would say he's not a man a young woman ought to spend time alone with, given what nobody knows about him." Adeline looked at him steadily. "What does nobody know?" The 3 men exchanged a glance. "That's kind of the point," said the second one, whose name she didn't know. "Nobody knows. He doesn't talk. He's been out there alone for 20 years, and there's a room in that house nobody's ever been in, and people have their theories." "Theories," she said. "It's just, we're saying be careful." Holt put his hands up slightly, a gesture of offered reasonableness. "We got no quarrel with you, you don't know him," Adeline said calmly, "and I do." She walked on. But what she was carrying by the time she got home was not anger. It was the particular discomfort of realizing that something she had been willing to leave alone was not something that other people were going to leave alone for her. The door, which had been simply a private thing, was becoming a story. And she knew enough about stories to know that when other people write them for you, they are almost never accurate. That evening she sat with her aunt and said, "Tell me about Silas." Clara looked up from her mending. "What did someone say?" "Multiple people. Multiple somethings." Adeline leaned back. "I want to know from you." Clara set down the mending. She was quiet for a moment, the way she went quiet when she was deciding how much of something to say. "When Silas first came to this country," she said, "he was 21. He had a little money, a lot of stubbornness, and apparently a woman back east he was going to marry. He bought the land and he built the house. Built all of it himself, and with hired hands. Took him 3 years. He put a nursery in it." Adeline waited. "She never came," Clara said simply. "Wrote him a letter instead. Said she'd married someone else. Someone her family had chosen. Someone without dust on his boots." She paused. "He locked that room. He's never opened it again, far as anyone knows. Never talked about it. Just kept working. Like the work was the only thing that made sense." 22 years, Adeline said quietly. 22 years, Clara agreed. "He's not a man with a dark secret, Adeline. He's a man with a wound he never let heal properly because healing it would have meant believing it could matter again to want something that much." She picked up her mending. "That's what scares people. They don't understand it, so they fill it in." Adeline sat with that for a long time. She went to the ranch on Saturday. He was replacing the weakened fence rail in the east pasture, the one he'd mentioned back in June, the one that had actually kept his word in a way she found she'd started expecting. She helped him carry the new rails and she held them in place while he hammered the supports. And the whole thing took about 2 hours and neither of them talked much. And that was fine. Afterward, on the porch, she asked him something she hadn't planned to ask. "Do you ever want to open that room?" He went still. Not alarmed exactly. More like a person who has just stepped onto uncertain ground and is deciding whether to step back or go forward. "Sometimes," he said. He turned his coffee cup. "More lately." "Why lately?" He looked at her for a moment, directly, the first time he'd done that in a while without looking away. "You know why," he said. The wind came sideways. Somewhere across the pasture, a horse moved through tall grass. "Silas," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something." He waited. "My father wants me home by September. I have a teaching position waiting. He has arrangements. Not a specific person, just a direction. The direction my life is supposed to go." She looked at her cup. "I don't know yet what I want to do about that." "You don't have to know," he said. "That's not quite true." "No." He exhaled. "No, I suppose it's not." He was quiet. Then, "I'm not asking you for anything, Adeline. I want you to know that. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you're sorting through, that's yours. I'm not trying to... I don't want you to feel like this is a place with expectations attached." "Why not?" she asked, and it came out more plainly than she intended. He looked at her again. "Because I built this place once for someone," he said, "with every expectation I was capable of having, and I learned that you can build something very carefully and still have it collapse." He turned the cup again. "I don't think you do what she did. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm not going to be the thing that asks you to give up your life." "What if I don't think of it as giving something up? You're 24 years old and you've been here 2 months. That's not an argument, that's arithmetic." He almost laughed. The almost laugh was, she was realizing, its own kind of thing, a sound he caught before it fully arrived, like he'd spent so long not laughing at things that his body remembered the impulse, but not quite the follow-through. "Go home to your father," he said. "Think about what you actually want, not what Wyoming feels like in summer, what you actually want when you're standing in your own life in November." It was not a rejection. She understood that. It was also not an invitation. It was something harder than either. It was a man trying very carefully not to be the kind of thing that hurt her the way something had once hurt him. She set her cup down and stood up. "I'll be here Saturday," she said. He said nothing, but he also didn't tell her not to come. She walked back to town with the wind following her and thought about a room no one had opened in 22 years, and what it cost a person to keep something locked that long, and whether the greater courage was in opening or in continuing not to. By the last week of August, the summer was ending whether she was ready or not. The last week of August arrived with a heat that felt personal, the kind that pressed down on everything and made even the wind feel tired. Adeline had stopped counting the days. She wasn't sure when that had happened, somewhere between the fence work and the coffee on the porch, and the conversation she kept turning over in her mind. The one where Silas had said, "You know why," and she had not disagreed with him. She had stopped counting and started simply living inside the days, which was not something she did easily or often. Clara noticed. Clara noticed most things but had the unusual quality of not commenting on them until they were ready to be commented on. "You got another letter from your father," she said one morning, setting it on the table beside Adeline's coffee without ceremony. "I know. I saw it come in yesterday." "You haven't opened it." "I know that too." Clara sat down across from her with the careful movement of a woman whose ribs were finally, slowly, cooperating again. She looked at the letter, and then at her niece, and then out the window. "He's going to want an answer about September. He always wants an answer about everything. He loves you." "I know he does." Adeline turned the letter over without opening it. "That's not actually the issue." "What is the issue?" Adeline was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to explain to him that I'm not the same person who got off that train in June, and I'm not sure he'll want to hear it even if I figure out the words." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then, "Thomas has been managing grief since your mother died by managing everything else, including you." She wasn't unkind about it. "It's what some people do. Control the things they can see because they can't control the thing they lost. I know, Adeline said. And she did know. She'd known it for a while, but knowing it and knowing what to do with it were different problems entirely. She opened the letter. Her father had written 4 pages, which was more than usual. The first 2 were practical. The teaching position, the house, a cousin's wedding in October he expected her to attend. The 3rd page was gentler and harder at the same time. He wrote about her mother briefly in the way he always wrote about her mother, with a precision that meant he was keeping something larger from spilling. He wrote that he worried about Adeline being alone with her grief in a strange place among strangers. He wrote the word lonely 3 times, which told her what he was actually afraid of, because Thomas Mercer named other people's feelings when he meant his own. The 4th page was 1 paragraph. It said, "I have heard from a friend of a friend who has family in Red Creek that you have been spending considerable time with a rancher considerably older than yourself. I do not know the particulars, and I prefer not to speculate. But I'm asking you directly, Adeline, come home by the 15th of September. The world is made of stories, and some stories, once started, are very hard to correct." She folded the letter, set it down. "Well," she said, "what did he say?" "He's heard about Silas." Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. "He's asking me to come home by the 15th. That's 3 weeks. Yes." They sat with that. The wind came through the kitchen window and moved the curtain, which needed washing and had needed it for 2 weeks, and neither of them had gotten to it. "What are you going to do?" Clara asked. "I don't know yet," Adeline said honestly. "But I'm going to the ranch on Saturday." She went on Saturday. And she told Silas about the letter. Not all of it, but the part that mattered, the part about the 15th and her father's request. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd learned about him. He didn't interrupt because he was actually listening, not building his next sentence while she was still finishing hers. When she was done, he said, "Are you going to go?" "I don't know." He nodded slowly, like that was a legitimate answer. He was mending a section of harness on the porch, his hands working at the leather while he talked. And he didn't stop working, which she'd also learned meant he was comfortable enough not to feel like the conversation required all of him. "How long has he been making decisions for you?" Silas asked. The question surprised her, not because it was wrong. "Since my mother got sick," she said, "which was about 3 years ago. Before that, I think he thought I could manage things myself. After, I think he decided the world was more dangerous than he'd previously believed." He pulled a stitch through the leather. "And you let him?" "I did. For a while. It was easier and he needed it." She looked at her hands. "But things that start because they're easier have a way of just staying." "Yeah," he said quietly. "They do." She looked at him. He wasn't talking about her anymore, or not only about her. "Silas," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" He glanced up. "Do you ever wish you'd fought harder, back then, for whatever it was?" His hands went still on the leather. Not long, just a pause, the kind that means something landed. "Fought how?" he said. "She made a choice. You can't argue someone out of a choice they've already made." "I know, but before she made it, when things were still, when there was still something to fight for." He set the harness down on the railing. He looked out across the yard toward the creek, and the silence lasted long enough that she thought maybe she'd pushed too far. "I was 21 years old, and I thought if I built the thing, that was enough," he said finally. "I thought the building proved the wanting. I thought she'd see the house and the land and know how much I meant it." He paused. "I never actually said the words, not the real ones. I wrote her letters about the acreage and the soil and the room I'd made for the future. I never once wrote what I actually felt because I didn't know how to say it, and I thought actions were supposed to say it for me." Adeline didn't say anything. "So did I fight for it?" He picked up the harness again. "No, I was 21 and I was stupid, and I built the evidence instead of saying the thing, and then it was too late to say it." He looked at the leather in his hands. "I'm not sure that's a mistake you can make twice and survive it the same way." She stayed until late afternoon, when the light went golden and long across the pasture and the horses moved toward the water in that slow end-of-day drift. When she rode dust back toward town, she had the feeling of something settling, not resolving, just settling, the way a house settles after years of weather. finding its actual shape. What she did not know, riding back along the creek, was that two people had watched her leave the ranch. Holt Reeder and a man named Carver, who owned land south of Silas's property and had the particular attitude of men who believed observation was the same thing as understanding, had been on the main road for reasons that were their own and had seen Adeline coming down the ranch road in the easy way of someone who knew the route, on a horse that wasn't hers, but that she rode like it was. By the next morning, that observation had reached Martha Crowley. Martha waited exactly 2 days before she did anything with it, which was not patience, it was strategy. She waited until the Wednesday market, when the most women were in the most places at once, and then she moved through those places with the information arranged very carefully in her mouth. She didn't say anything false. That was the thing about Martha. She rarely said anything technically false. She said that the school teacher from Illinois had been seen leaving Silas Granger's ranch on a borrowed horse in the late afternoon, and that this had been happening for weeks, and that she had nothing against the girl personally. She truly didn't, but someone ought to be looking out for her. A young woman who had lost her mother and been sent away to recover ought to have people around her who understood the situation. She doesn't know this town, Martha said to the 4 women gathered at the dry goods counter. She doesn't know that man. She sees a quiet, hard-working rancher, and she thinks she knows what she's looking at. But there's a room in that house no one has ever entered. There's a reason he's been alone for 20 years. And a grieving girl with a protective father who doesn't know what's happening, well, one has to pay attention. The concern in her voice was real. That was what made it effective. Martha Crowley genuinely believed what she was saying, which was far more dangerous than simple malice, because genuine belief sounds like care, and care is very hard to argue with. Adeline heard about it within 48 hours, because in a town of 300 people, information moved the way water moved, along every available channel until it had been everywhere. It was Clara who told her, directly, in the kitchen, not softening it. Martha's been telling people you're being taken advantage of, Clara said. She's using the words naive and vulnerable and someone ought to intervene. She mentioned your mother. She mentioned your age. Adeline set down her fork. The anger was immediate and specific. Not the hot, scattered kind, but the cold, focused kind, which was the more dangerous variety. She doesn't know what she's talking about, Adeline said. No, but she says it like she does, which is what makes it stick. What does she want? Does she actually want something, or is this just... Adeline stopped. Is this just how she fills her days? Clara chose her words carefully. Martha lost her husband 6 years ago. Before that, she ran his household, and she was good at it, and it mattered, and people saw it. After, she still runs things, but the things she runs are smaller. People are easier to manage than grief. She paused. That doesn't excuse it. I'm not saying it excuses it. I'm just saying there's a reason underneath the behavior, and the reason is human, even if the behavior isn't helpful. It's going to get back to Silas. It already has, I expect. Adeline stood up from the table and went to the window. The main street was quiet in the mid-morning lull, a dog sleeping in a patch of shade, the general store's door standing open. I'm going to talk to her, she said. Adeline, not to fight, just to... She needs to know that I'm not the story she thinks she's telling. Clara made the face of someone who doubted this would accomplish what her niece hoped, but knew better than to say so plainly. All right, she said. But take a breath first. Adeline took a breath. Then she found Martha Crowley at the post office at 11 in the morning and asked if they could speak privately, which Martha agreed to with the smooth pleasantness of a woman who was never caught off guard. They stood at the side of the building in the shade. Martha had her parasol and her careful hair, and her expression of gentle concern already assembled. I understand you've been worried about me, Adeline said. I have been, Martha said. I think anyone who cared about this community would be. I appreciate that you come from a place of caring. She kept her voice steady. But I need you to understand something. I am not grieving in a way that impairs my judgment. I am not naive about Silas Granger's character or intentions. I am a grown woman who has made considered choices about how I spend my time, and the story you've been telling about me in this town is not accurate. Martha looked at her with that expression that was either warmth or its replica. My dear, I don't doubt your intentions. I question the situation. The situation, Adeline said, is that a decent man has lived alone on that ranch for 20 years, and has been quietly judged by people who don't know him for reasons that are more about their own discomfort than about anything he's actually done. She paused. And I'm not going to let that continue without saying so plainly. Something shifted in Martha's expression. Not retreat. More like recalibration. You're young, Martha said, and her voice had lost just a fraction of its warmth. I am, Adeline agreed. And you're not foolish, Mrs. Crowley, so I think you know that being young isn't the same as being wrong. She walked away before Martha could respond, which she knew was not the diplomatic ending and didn't particularly care. What she did not see, walking away, was the expression on Martha's face, which was not anger, actually, but something more complicated, something that looked almost like respect running alongside the decision to not be deterred. By Friday, the shape of the gossip had shifted. It was less about Adeline's vulnerability now and more about her choice, a distinction that, if anything, made it worse, because a girl who was being taken advantage of was pitiable, but a girl who had chosen this on her own was culpable. The town moved the story from one category to another without losing interest in it. And then, on Saturday, while Adeline was helping Silas replace a rotted water trough in the south pasture, 3 men rode into the ranch yard. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of horses on the yard, 2 or 3 of them, moving with a purpose that wasn't casual. She and Silas were behind the barn, and Silas straightened when he heard it and walked around to the front without hurrying, which meant he either knew who it was or had decided it didn't matter. It was Holt Reeder and Carver and a third man she didn't recognize, older, with a wide hat and an expression of deliberate severity. Granger, Holt said. He stayed on his horse, which was a statement. Reeder, Silas said. He stood in the center of the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and the particular stillness of a man who was not going to be moved easily. We need to talk about the Webb girl. Holt nodded in Adeline's direction without looking at her. Her name, Silas said, is Miss Mercer. Miss Mercer, then. Holt's jaw tightened slightly. She's a stranger to this county. Young woman who lost her mother and came out here to recover. People are concerned. Which people? A lot of people. Holt looked at him directly. She's been here every week. She's on your horses, she's in your house. On my porch, Silas said, drinking coffee. We're not accusing you of anything specific. That was the older man, the one whose name she didn't know, and his voice was the careful voice of someone who had thought about this more than the others. We're saying that the optics of the situation for a young woman from out of town are optics, Silas repeated. The appearance of it. I know what the word means. He was very quiet, very still. Miss Mercer is a guest here who comes of her own choosing for reasons of her own. She is not a child, and I am not holding her here. If you have concerns about her well-being, you could ask her directly, since she's standing right there. All 3 men looked at Adeline. She met Holt's eyes. I'm fine, she said. I'm better than fine, and I'd like you to think about what you're doing here, because what I see is 3 men riding onto another man's property to question how he spends time with a woman who has not asked for your help and is not in any danger. Holt had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The older man did not. With respect, Miss Mercer, your father is a long way away, and my father has nothing to do with this, she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and didn't try to blunt it. I am responsible for myself. I have been my entire adult life, whatever it might look like from a distance. The 3 men exchanged a look. It was the look of people who had expected a different kind of response and were recalibrating. We'll be watching, Holt said finally, which was less a threat than it was the only exit he could find. All right, Silas said. Just that. They rode out. The yard was quiet again. A horse in the corral stamped once and settled. Silas stood in the center of the yard for a moment after they left, and then he turned around and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not quite embarrassed, but adjacent to it. Worn. I'm sorry you had to sit through that, he said. I'm not sorry I was here for it. She came forward out of the barn shadow. Does that happen a lot? Never quite like that before. He ran a hand over the back of his neck. But people have always had opinions about the ranch, about me being alone out here. Usually it stays at opinions. Martha Crowley is pushing it past opinions. Yeah. He looked toward where the 3 men had ridden out. She's not wrong that it looks a certain way. She's wrong about what it means. He looked at her. Adeline, don't, she said. I'm not going to... You're going to say something careful and responsible about my reputation or my future or the unfairness of the situation, and I appreciate all of those things, but I'd rather just go back and finish the water trough." He was quiet for a moment. Then the almost laugh came, further along than usual, actually reaching sound before he stopped it. "All right," he said. They went back and finished the water trough. But the three men's visit sat in the air between them differently than it had before, because it had made something concrete that had previously been only felt. The town was not going to let this continue without consequence, and they both knew it, and pretending they didn't know it would have required a kind of dishonesty that neither of them was capable of. On the ride back, the sky to the west had a color in it that Silas had once told her meant a change coming. Not necessarily a storm, but weather, a shift. She thought about her father's letter. The 15th of September was 11 days away. She thought about what Silas had said on the porch weeks ago, about being 21 and building the house instead of saying the thing. She thought about all the things that go unsaid because people believe the actions should be enough, and then discover too late that actions without words are just evidence with no testimony. She was not 21. She was 24, which wasn't enormously different, except that she'd spent those 3 extra years watching her father survive loss by managing everything around him, and she'd understood at close range what it cost a person to be fluent in control and silent in feeling. She didn't want that. She had not known how much she didn't want it until she'd spent a summer watching a man who had made the opposite mistake, who had spoken through work and building and steady presence and never through words, and understanding that the two errors were different shapes of the same thing. She did not go to the ranch the following Saturday. Not because she had decided anything, but because she needed to be in her own thoughts for a while without the weight of his presence making everything feel more clarified and more impossible at the same time. She wrote her father back instead. It took 4 drafts. The first was too defensive. The second was too explanatory. The third was too emotional in the way that would give her father something to manage rather than something to hear. The fourth one she wrote in one sitting, quickly, without stopping to revise. And it was the most honest thing she'd written in longer than she could easily say. She told him she was not coming home on the 15th. She told him she was not in trouble and not being manipulated and not too young to know her own mind, though she understood why he worried. She told him, and this was the hardest part, the part she'd rewritten most in the 3 failed drafts, that she thought he had been managing her the way he managed his own grief, and that she loved him for it, but that she needed him to stop. She told him she wasn't sure yet what September looked like, but she needed the space to find out. She sealed the letter before she could read it again and carried it to the post office herself. On the way back, she ran into Martha Crowley on the main street, and Martha stopped, and Adeline thought for a moment that another conversation was coming, but Martha only looked at her with that complicated expression that had lived in her face since their last exchange, and said, "You have more spine than I initially credited you with." It was not an apology. Adeline didn't expect one. "Thank you," she said, and meant it approximately. The following week brought the first suggestion of autumn in the mornings, a sharpness in the early air, a change in the angle of the light that made everything look slightly more deliberate. Adeline went back to the ranch on a Thursday instead of a Saturday because she wanted to, and because she was done with schedules she hadn't chosen. Silas was splitting wood when she arrived, which he did every fall with the focus of someone who understood that winter was not a surprise but a certainty, and preparation was respect for that certainty. He stopped when he heard her horse and turned, and his expression did that thing it had started doing, something that moved through the careful neutral of his face and became briefly, simply glad. He didn't say he was glad. He said, "I thought you weren't coming this week." "I changed my mind," she said, getting down from dust. "That's allowed." "It's allowed," he agreed and went back to the wood. She helped him stack it, which was not skilled work. It was just picking up the split pieces and carrying them to the pile. But it was useful, and she'd learned that useful was its own kind of conversation with Silas. He didn't require you to talk to feel your company. He just required you to be actually there. They worked until noon. Then she told him about the letter she'd sent her father. He listened. Then he said, "What do you think he'll do?" "He'll come," she said. "That's what my father does when he doesn't know what else to do. He arrives." "Here?" "Here." Silas looked at the woodpile. "All right," he said. "You're not worried?" He looked at her with an expression that was not exactly amusement, but had something of it. I've been on this land for 22 years. I'm not going to be frightened off it by your father arriving. He paused. But I think you are. She started to say she wasn't, and stopped, because it wasn't true. She was not frightened of her father. She was frightened of what it would mean to stand in front of him and not retreat, which she had never once done in 3 years of retreating, and which was going to require something from her that she wasn't entirely certain she had yet. I might be, she admitted. You'll be all right, he said. That's very helpful, thank you. I know, he said, straight-faced, and this time the almost laugh came all the way through before he caught it. An actual sound, brief, real. She had never heard it fully before. It changed his face in a way that was painful to look at directly, because it showed what the face had been missing for 22 years. She looked at her hands instead. Silas, she said, you said before that you're not asking me for anything. I'm not. I know, but… She stopped, found the word. I need you to understand that what I'm deciding right now, whatever it turns out to be, I'm deciding it for myself. Not because you asked for it, not to prove something to Martha Crowley or those men who rode in here or my father. She looked up. This is mine, whatever I choose. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were still at his sides, and the wood-splitting axe was stuck in the block behind him, and the light was coming at that low autumn angle across everything. I know that, he said. I've always known that about you. She nodded. Good, she said. A hawk crossed the sky overhead. 2 of them, actually, turning in wide circles, riding something invisible. Somewhere in the western hills, weather was building. She could feel it in the air. Something accumulating, something that hadn't broken yet. The weather Adeline had felt building in the western hills arrived 4 days later, not as a storm, but as a rumor. It came the way the worst things in small towns always come. Not announced, not direct, but moving through the spaces between people, changing shape as it traveled, picking up details it had never actually contained. By the time it reached Clara's kitchen on a Tuesday morning, carried by a neighbor woman named Dottie Marsh, who stopped in under the pretense of returning a borrowed pie tin, it had become something specific and damaging. People are saying, Dottie said, with the careful positioning of someone who wanted to deliver information while appearing reluctant to do so, that Silas Granger has been deliberately seeking out the company of vulnerable young women for years, that there were others before Adeline, that the locked room is, well, people have theories. Clara looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression that was almost frighteningly calm. What people? I don't know exactly who started it, but you know it isn't true. Dottie had the grace to look uncomfortable. I know what I know about Silas, which isn't much. Most people don't. That, Clara said, is precisely the problem. When Dottie left, Clara sat at the table with her tea going cold and her hands folded on the surface in front of her and said nothing for a full 2 minutes. Adeline had heard everything from the hallway. She came in and sat down. It's Martha, Adeline said. It may not be Martha directly, but it's the shape of thing Martha started. Clara looked at her. Someone has taken what she said and made it worse. The story about vulnerable young women. That's not something Martha would say. She's too careful. But she created the conditions for someone less careful to say it. I need to tell Silas. He may already know. He did already know. When Adeline rode out to the ranch that same afternoon, arriving unannounced in a way she wouldn't have done 2 months ago, but did now without thinking, she found him standing in the yard with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness of a man who has received news and is deciding what to do with it. Pete Alcott, his nearest neighbor to the north, was sitting on the porch rail. Pete was 60-something, weathered, and had the quality of someone who had spent so many years being direct that he'd lost the capacity for anything else. She's heard, Pete said when he saw Adeline ride in. It wasn't unkind, just accurate. I've heard, she confirmed, getting down. Silas looked at her. His jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was keeping something tightly controlled. It's nothing, he said. It's not nothing, Pete said. It's a lie that's moving fast through a town of 300 people, which is the worst kind of lie because there's nowhere for it to go except back and forth until it wears grooves. What are you going to do? Adeline asked Silas. Nothing, he said. What am I supposed to do? Go into town and tell people their gossip is wrong? That makes it worse. You engage with a story like that, and you feed it. You don't engage and it grows on its own, Pete said. Either way it grows. Silas uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his pockets, which was the posture of a man who had decided something but wasn't ready to say it. This isn't new. I've been the subject of this town's imagination for 20 years. I've managed it by not managing it. The difference, Adeline said carefully, is that this time it has a specific accusation attached, and the accusation involves me, which means it's not something I can just let sit. He looked at her. What do you want to do? She didn't have a clean answer. She knew what she didn't want. She didn't want to do nothing, and she didn't want to do something loud and defensive that gave the story more air. But the space between those two things was not obvious. I want people to actually know you, she said, instead of knowing the version they've made up. That's not something you can force, Silas said. No, she agreed, but it's something that can happen. Pete looked between them and said nothing, which was his form of diplomacy. What happened next was not something any of them planned or could have anticipated, and it arrived from a direction none of them were watching. On Thursday morning, 3 days before Thomas Mercer's train was due to arrive in Red Creek, he had written back to Adeline's letter with a single-paragraph reply that said he was coming on the 19th and expected to have a conversation, which was his way of announcing something without asking permission. Holt, Reeder, and Carver, and the older man, whose name she'd since learned was Drummond, gathered on the south road at the edge of Silas's eastern pasture. Adeline would not learn what they had intended until later. She would learn that they had been talking for 2 weeks, in the back room of the hotel dining room, and in the livery and wherever men talk when they believe they are being reasonable, and that the conversation had moved from concern to frustration to something that felt in their chests like righteous action, which is one of the most dangerous feelings a person can have. They had not gone there to cause harm. That was the terrible truth of it. They had gone there to send a message, to make clear to Silas Granger that the community was watching, that his behavior had been noted, that a man who kept secrets and cultivated the company of a young grieving woman was not operating without consequence. What they actually did was carry lanterns onto dry grassland in late summer. The first fire took hold in the eastern pasture grass before anyone fully understood what had happened. Drummond said later that a lantern slipped. Carver said the wind took a spark. Holt said nothing, which was its own answer. What mattered was that within 20 minutes, a line of fire was running northeast toward Silas's fence line, with the speed of something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of weather, dry weeks, a northwest wind, grass that had stood uncut through the heat of August. Adeline was at Clara's house when she smelled it. It was not a campfire smell. It was something larger, something with urgency underneath it, and she was at the window before she had consciously decided to move. The smoke was east of town, which meant east of town was the Granger Ranch. She was on dust and moving before Clara had finished calling her name. She came over the creek rise and saw it. The fire line along the eastern pasture already 40 yards wide. The wind pushing it northwest toward the barn. The horses in the outer corral moving in tight circles with their ears back and their eyes rolling. Silas was already at the water pump, filling a line of buckets in a chain he was trying to work alone, and Pete Alcott's wagon was coming from the north at a dead run. "The horses!" Silas shouted when he saw her. She didn't stop to answer. She went straight to the outer corral, got the gate open, and started moving the horses out toward the creek with the particular focused urgency of someone who didn't know exactly what they were doing but knew what needed to happen. 3 horses came through the gate without much trouble. The 4th, the big roan, the same animal that had nearly come apart in June, planted itself against the far fence with its nostrils wide and its hindquarters bunched. "Come on," she said, and her voice came out lower than she expected, steadier than she felt. She got in close, got her hand on the halter the way she'd seen Silas do it, and she said something in that same kind of voice. Not words exactly, just sound with authority in it. And the roan moved. Not happily, but it moved. She got all 4 horses through and pointed toward the creek before she turned back. By then Pete had arrived and 2 more men from the north had come over the ridge, having seen the smoke from their own land, and the bucket line was longer and the water was reaching the closest edge of the fire. But the barn was in danger. The fire had turned with the wind and the line was eating toward the south wall of the main barn faster than the buckets were cutting it back. Silas knew it. She could see it in the way he looked at the barn and then at the fire line and did the math that was not good math. "Wet blankets," Pete called. "Back wall." Silas was already moving. The 2 men from the north were right behind him. Adeline grabbed a blanket from the porch, got it soaking in the water barrel, and dragged it around to the back of the barn where the fire was closest. The smoke was thick enough to sting, and the heat had a sound to it, a low continuous crackling she felt as much as heard. The next 30 minutes were not heroic in any clean way. They were clumsy and frightening and exhausting, 4 people and then 6 as more neighbors arrived, working a bucket line that kept threatening to collapse, beating at grass fire with wet sacks, dragging wet barriers along the barn wall. Adeline's arms were burning. Her eyes were watering constantly. At one point she dropped a full bucket and lost a minute recovering it, and felt the specific frustration of a person failing at something with consequences. Silas moved through the whole thing with the efficiency of someone who had made peace with the fear and was just working. She watched him when she could and used what she saw to calibrate herself. When he moved faster, she moved faster. When he changed direction, there was a reason. They stopped the fire 11 feet from the barn wall. When it was over, when the last of the running line was extinguished and the smoke was hanging over the valley in a low gray veil, and everyone had stopped moving with that particular way of stopping when the emergency has ended and the body hasn't been told yet, people stood in the yard and looked at each other. Silas's hands were red. Not burned badly, but the right one had caught some heat at some point, and the skin across the knuckles was tight and bright. He was looking at the barn wall, at the char line in the grass that said how close it had come. He didn't say anything. Nobody said anything for a while. There were 7 people in the yard by then. Pete, 2 men from the north she'd seen but not met, a young man who had come from town when he'd seen the smoke, and a woman from the nearest neighboring property who had arrived in the last 20 minutes and helped with the wet blankets without a word of introduction. It was Pete who said, finally, "Wind shifted. That's all that saved it." "Wind in the water barrel being full," said one of the northern men. He was looking at Silas. "You always keep it full?" "Habit," Silas said. "Good habit." More quiet. The roan and the other horses were visible at the creek bank, heads down, beginning to settle. The smoke was thinning at the edges. The young man from town, he was maybe 17, and Adeline had seen him working at the livery, was looking at the char line with the expression of someone putting something together. "There were men on the south road this morning," he said, to no one in particular. Everyone looked at him. 3 of them. I saw them going east on the south road before I opened up the livery. They had lanterns." He stopped, like he was aware of what he was saying and was weighing whether to finish it. Then, "I didn't think anything of it at the time." The silence that followed that statement was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Silas turned and looked at the eastern pasture, at the origin point of the fire, at the south road visible in the middle distance. Pete said very quietly, "Holt and Carver were talking at the hotel Wednesday night. I heard pieces of it." "What kind of pieces?" Silas said. His voice was flat in a way that was not his usual quiet. It was the flat of something being suppressed very deliberately. The kind where men convince themselves that doing something stupid is actually doing something necessary, Pete said. He looked at the ground. "I should have said something then. I didn't take it as seriously as I should have." Adeline was watching Silas. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before, moving through several things at once, none of them clean. Anger was in there, yes, but underneath it was something older and heavier, something that looked like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been misunderstood for so long that even the confirmation of it doesn't surprise him. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. She didn't have a sentence ready. She just looked at him and hoped that was enough. He let out a breath, long and slow, and some of the flatness went with it. "All right," he said, mostly to himself. Then, to the people in the yard, "Thank you. All of you. I mean that." The neighboring woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, said briskly, "Your fence along the east line needs checking before tonight. I'll help with that." And she walked toward the gate as if the matter were settled, which it apparently was. The people from the north offered to come back the next day with more hands to clear the burned grass. The livery boy looked like he wanted to say something else, but settled for nodding and heading back toward town. Pete stayed. When it was just the 3 of them, Silas, Pete, and Adeline, Pete said, "Someone needs to tell the town what happened here, not the dramatic version, just the facts." "It'll come out on its own," Silas said. "It'll come out in whatever shape it comes out in, and that shape might not be useful," Pete said. I was looking at Silas with the directness of a man who had earned the right to it over years. I know you don't like saying things in public. I know you think silence is cleaner. But there are 7 people who just saw what happened here, and 7 people talk. And the question is whether what they say has any true bones in it, or whether it's just feeling. Silas looked at his burned hand. He turned it over. What do you want me to say? The truth, Pete said. That men came onto your land and started a fire because they'd let gossip replace judgment. And that people from this community, people who'd been suspicious of you for years, came out here and put that fire out anyway. He paused. That's a story that might actually do something useful. Adeline said, He's right. Silas looked at her, then at Pete, then at the barn wall with the char line in the grass in front of it. I'll think about it, he said, which from Silas was closer to yes than it sounded. Pete nodded and went to help with the fence. Adeline and Silas stood alone in the yard. The smoke smell was everywhere, faintly sweet and acrid at the same time, and the light was beginning to go long and gold the way it did in late afternoon. Your hand, she said. It's fine. Let me see it. He held it out with the slight reluctance of a man who doesn't enjoy being attended to. She looked at the knuckles, red, tight, not blistered. She'd seen her aunt treat rope burns and minor scalds in the kitchen and knew enough to know this wasn't serious. She said so. I know it's not serious, he said. Then stop looking at it like it is. I'm not looking at it like anything. I'm just... He stopped. Thinking, she said. Yeah. She let him think. The horses at the creek had moved back up the bank and were grazing in the late light with the calm of animals who have already forgotten their panic, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about horses. They moved through fear and came out the other side and didn't carry it forward. The room, Silas said suddenly. She looked at him. He was staring at the house. At the hallway window that corresponded, she knew now, to where the second door sat. I've been thinking about it, he said, for a while. Not just since for longer than just this summer. He turned the burned hand over again. The fire got close to the house tonight. It didn't reach it. It could have. He was quiet. I stood there at one point looking at that back wall and thinking about everything inside that house. The things I'd want to save if it went. He looked at her. I thought about that room and I couldn't figure out what I felt about it. Whether I'd want to save what's in there or whether I'd almost... He stopped hard. That's not a decent thing to say. Say it anyway. He didn't want to. She waited. Whether I'd almost be relieved, he said quietly. If it was gone. If the decision got made for me that way. He looked away. That's not decent. It's honest, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her. The almost laugh wasn't there this time. There was just the look itself, something tired and real and more open than she'd ever seen his face. Will you? He stopped, started again. I want to open it. I've been saying I'll think about it, and I've been thinking about it, and the thinking isn't helping anymore. He reached into it and brought out a key, old brass, worn almost smooth. He'd had it on him. She realized he'd been carrying it on him, possibly for a long time. Will you come inside with me? It was not quite a question. The inflection was wrong for a question, or maybe right in a different way. The way a person says something they're terrified of saying and can't afford to wait for a response before committing to the sentence. Yes, she said. They went inside. The house was quiet and smelled of smoke from outside seeping through the walls. The kitchen, the main room, the familiar arrangement of practical things. The hallway. The door. He stood in front of it for a moment, key in hand, and she stood half a step behind him and to the side and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would help. He put the key in the lock. The mechanism was stiff, years of disuse, and he had to work it, and for a moment she thought it wouldn't turn, but then it did, with a sound that was too loud in the silent house. He pushed the door open. The air that came out was still and particular. Not bad exactly, but the air of a space that had been closed off from everything for a very long time. The curtains on the single window were pale and had faded to the color of old paper. The light came through thin, enough to see by. She stood in the doorway and looked. The cradle was against the far wall, small, handmade, the joints tight in the way of something built by someone who cared deeply about the building. Beside it, a low shelf with objects on it, a small carved horse, a folded blanket, a tin rattle. Against the left wall, a small table with a chair, and on the table a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon that had once been blue. The room was not frightening, it was not morbid, it was quiet in the way of preserved things. Things that had been kept from time rather than destroyed by it. Silas stood in the doorway, and she stood beside him, and neither of them moved. "How long did it take you to build all this?" she said finally, not loudly. "About 2 years." His voice was carefully level. "I did the cradle myself. Couldn't afford to buy one, and I wanted it to be right." He paused. "She knew I was building it. I wrote her about it. I described every joint." Something moved in his face. "I thought describing it was the same as showing it to her." Adeline looked at the cradle, at the careful joinery, the small curved rockers, the thing built by a 21-year-old man who had believed in the future with his whole body. "Silas," she said. "Don't," he said, in the same tone she'd used on him weeks ago. "I wasn't going to say I'm sorry." He looked at her. "I was going to say that you built something real," she said. "The intention of it was real. She made a choice. That was hers to make, even if it was wrong, even if it was cruel without meaning to be. But what you built was real." He was quiet. "And you've been locked in here as long as the room has," she said. "Longer, maybe. Because you could walk around and work and be useful, and it looked like living." He looked at the letters on the table. "I've never opened those since the day they arrived." "You don't have to." "I know." He crossed to the table and picked up the stack. He held it with both hands, looking at the top letter, at his own name in handwriting he hadn't seen in 22 years. "She wasn't a bad person," he said. "I need to say that because it would be easier if she was, and I don't want to take the easy version." He set the letters back down. "She was a person who was afraid, and when the moment came, she chose the fear. I understand it. I just couldn't carry it and keep moving at the same time, so I put it in here. And locked it. And locked it." The curtains moved slightly, though Adeline couldn't feel a draft. "What do you want to do with it?" she asked. He looked around the room, the cradle, the shelf, the letters. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I need it to be a room again, not a monument." He looked at her. "Whatever that takes." She nodded. "All right." They left the door open when they went back into the hallway. Not all the way. It stayed ajar, spilling pale light into the hall, but open. On the porch, in the cooling evening with the smoke smell settling over the valley and the horses quiet at the creek, Pete called over from the fence line that the east section was holding and he'd be back tomorrow. Silas called back that he appreciated it. Then they sat in the 2 porch chairs, and the dark came down around the ranch, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and that was all right. What neither of them had spoken aloud, because it was still the kind of thing that lived in the space between words, was that tomorrow Thomas Mercer's train was due at Red Creek Station at 2 in the afternoon. That whatever had happened tonight, the fire, the room, the key, was not the end of anything. That the story was still mid-sentence, and that sentence had another voice coming that neither of them could predict. The smoke drifted west. The stars came up over Wyoming the way they always did, comprehensive, indifferent, and somehow still personal in the way of large things seen from a small place on the earth. Adeline sat in the porch chair and felt the ache in her arms from the bucket line, and thought about a man who had carried a key in his pocket for longer than she could know, waiting for the day he could bring himself to use it. She thought about rooms and what we put in them. She thought about what it meant to let air back into a closed place. She was still sitting there, still thinking, when she heard the distant sound of a horse on the north road, Pete heading home. And Silas said, very quietly, as if it were not the most significant thing he'd said all summer, "I'm glad you stayed." She didn't answer right away. She thought about the right word, the true one, and when she found it, she used it. "Me too," she said. The wind came through the valley, softer now, from the south, carrying the smell of the creek and the distant cattle and the cooling ash of the eastern pasture. And somewhere in the direction of town, a light went out in a window and the world kept its own counsel about what came next. Thomas Mercer's train arrived 11 minutes late, which gave Adeline 11 extra minutes to stand on the platform and reconsider every choice she had made since June. She did not reconsider them, but she stood there and felt the weight of them, which was different. The platform at Red Creek Station was not large. 4 benches, a ticket window, a hand-painted sign that had needed repainting for 2 seasons. The station master had swept it that morning, which was either coincidence or the particular way small towns prepared themselves for the arrival of someone from outside. Adeline stood near the end of the platform with her hands at her sides and her back straight in the way she'd developed over years of being a daughter who was inspected before being approved. She had not brought Clara. Clara had offered, and Adeline had thanked her and said no, because some conversations needed to happen without a second person absorbing the edges. She had not brought Silas. That conversation, if it needed to happen at all, was not the first one. The train came in trailing its usual noise and vapor, and when it cleared and the passengers began to step down, she saw her father before he saw her. He was moving with the particular efficiency of a man who traveled frequently and did not waste time on the mechanics of arrival, hat on, bag in hand, eyes already scanning. He was 61 now, and she noticed, as she always noticed when she hadn't seen him for a while, that he was slightly older than he'd been. The hair more gray, the lines around his eyes deeper. He had the build of a man who had once been broader and had thinned with years rather than collapsed with them, which was its own kind of stubbornness. He saw her and his face moved through several things very quickly. Relief, because she was there and intact, and something harder underneath because he was still her father, and the letter she had sent him had not been the letter he was hoping for. "Adeline," he said, and hugged her with the careful precision of a man who had not quite figured out how to be physically demonstrative without making it feel like a formality. "Dad," she said and hugged him back the same way. He stepped back and looked at her. It was a thorough look, the kind she knew, the kind that was checking for damage. "You look well," he said. It sounded almost like an accusation. "I am well," she said. "Are you hungry? The hotel has a decent dining room." "I could eat," he said. They walked from the platform to the hotel dining room without talking about anything that mattered, which was a Mercer family skill. They talked about the train, about the weather in Illinois, which had been humid and unpleasant, about the brief stop in Denver. They sat at a corner table and ordered, and the food came and they ate some of it, and the whole time Thomas Mercer was building himself toward the conversation he'd come to have, and Adeline could see him doing it the way you can see weather from a distance. It was her father who broke first. "Tell me about him," Thomas said. He set his fork down and looked at her directly, which was his way of signaling that they were done with the preliminary round. "Silas Granger," she said. "That's the name I was given. He's 43 years old. He's been ranching this land for 22 years. He is the most genuinely decent man I've met in my adult life. And I've spent my adult life around people who perform decency rather than live it." She held her father's gaze. "He has never once asked me for anything. He has never once tried to hold me here or influence my choices. He has shown me how to work and how to be still and how to exist in a place without needing the place to be something other than what it is." Thomas listened to this without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. "And you have feelings for him," he said when she was done. "Yes." "He's 19 years older than you. I know the arithmetic." "Adeline, Dad." She said it gently but without give. "I need you to hear the actual sentence I'm saying instead of the sentence you're expecting. I'm not a girl who was lonely and found the nearest available man. I'm a person who spent a summer learning who she is when nobody's managing her, and what I found was a man worth staying for." She paused. "Those are different things." Thomas was quiet. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table, once, twice, a habit she'd watched her whole life. "What happened to the teaching position?" "It's still there. I could still take it." "But you're not going to." She didn't answer right away. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer. What I know is that I'm not coming back in September. What comes after September is still mine to figure out." "You're 24 years old. I know how old I am. Your mother—" He stopped. She waited. "Your mother would have been— She would have had opinions," he said, which was the closest he had come in 14 months to saying that he didn't know what her mother would have wanted, which was different from having opinions. "She would have," Adeline agreed. "But she also would have asked me what I wanted before she offered hers." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, something she didn't have a name for, something that looked like the particular pain of realizing you've been doing something for a long time that you thought was right and are only now beginning to doubt. "I'd like to meet him," he said. She had not expected it to come that fast. "All right," she said carefully. Not, "I'm not coming to inspect him or make a decision," Thomas said, and she heard him working to mean it as he said it. "I want to see what you're seeing, because clearly I've been seeing something else." She thought about that for a moment. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll take you out to the ranch tomorrow." He nodded. "All right." He picked up his fork again. "Is the food here always this plain?" "Always," she said. "You get used to it." He made the face of a man who doubted this but was too tired from the train to debate it. That night, lying in the narrow bed in Clara's spare room while her father slept in the hotel across the street, Adeline looked at the ceiling and felt the shape of what was coming. Not dread, exactly. Something more complicated than dread, which had fear in it, but also the particular alertness of a person standing at the point where several things are going to happen at once, and there is nothing to do but be present for all of them. She thought about Silas, who had gone to bed last night in a house with a door standing open for the first time in 22 years. She thought about what that open door cost him, and how he'd done it anyway, and how some forms of courage looked like nothing from the outside. Just a man standing in a hallway, just a key turning in an old lock. But were everything from the inside. She was at the ranch by 9 the next morning. Alone, first. She wanted to give Silas some notice. He was in the barn when she arrived, checking on the horses that had spent the night near the creek. The roan was back in the corral and looked untroubled, which was the particular resilience of animals that do not remember yesterday the way people do. "My father wants to meet you," she said in the doorway. Silas looked up from the horse's foreleg he'd been examining. "Today?" "This afternoon, if that's all right." He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. He didn't pretend it was simple. "All right," he said. What's his state of mind coming in?" "Cautious," she said, "but genuinely trying, which is the best version of my father." Silas nodded. He set the horse's leg down carefully. "The east fence is still a mess from last night. I was going to work on it this morning." "I'll help," she said, "and then we can have coffee ready when he arrives." He looked at her. "You make it sound very manageable." "I'm trying to," she said. "It helps me." Something in his face settled slightly. "All right," he said again, and handed her a pair of work gloves from the hook on the barn wall. "East fence." They worked the fence for 2 hours, the burned sections needing pulling out, and the posts needing checking, and a new wire run along 60 feet of the eastern line. The work was good. The work was always good in the way it imposed a simple logic on complicated mornings. This needs doing, so you do it, and the thing is done, and the next thing is they're waiting. At noon, she rode back to town and collected her father from the hotel. Thomas Mercer on a horse was not a natural thing. He rode with the careful, upright posture of someone following instructions, which was not wrong, just apparent. Adeline rode beside him on dust and said nothing about it and did not offer assistance he hadn't asked for, which was something she'd learned from Silas. They came over the creek rise and the ranch was visible below, and Thomas looked at it for a moment. The low house, the 2 barns, the fencing running out across the pastures, the char line in the east grass still visible as a dark stripe. "That's from last night," Adeline said, seeing where he was looking. "What happened last night?" She had not told him in detail. She had said there was a fire and it was handled. She told him now, briefly, factually. The 3 men on the south road, the lanterns, the fire taking hold, the neighbors who came. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Men from this town set a fire on his land. Accidentally, probably, but they were there deliberately, and it was because of the gossip. She paused. And then people from this same town came out and helped fight it. That's the part I keep coming back to. He looked at her, then back at the ranch. "All right," he said. "Let's go down." Silas was on the porch when they rode in. He had cleaned up, not dressed up, that wasn't his way. But the work dust was gone and he'd changed his shirt and his hands were clean, and he stood at the top of the porch steps in the straightforward way of a man who was not going to perform anything. Thomas dismounted, which took a moment, and walked across the yard and put out his hand. "Thomas Mercer," he said. "Silas Granger." He shook it firmly. Neither man crushed the other's hand, which Adeline found genuinely relieving. "Come and sit." They sat on the porch, the 3 of them, and Adeline poured the coffee she'd made while Silas watched her father with the direct, patient attention he gave everything he was genuinely trying to understand. Thomas looked at the ranch. "You built this yourself?" "Mostly," Silas said. Started with the north pasture, added on as the land allowed. How many head are you running now? 63 cattle, 12 horses, down from the summer numbers. I moved some off before winter. Thomas nodded. He was doing the thing Adeline recognized, converting unfamiliar emotional territory into practical information, because practical information was something he could assess. It was his way of moving forward without moving too fast. She did not try to stop it. They talked about the land for a while, about the water rights, which Silas explained briefly, and about the winter feed situation, and about the eastern pasture damage and what it would take to regrow it. Thomas asked careful questions and Silas answered them without embellishment, and somewhere in the back and forth a small degree of mutual recognition began to develop, the kind that happens between people who both respect work and can see when work has been done well. Then Thomas said, "My daughter tells me you've never asked her for anything." Silas looked at him. "That's right." "She said it like it was a virtue," Thomas said. He was not quite challenging, he was a probing. But a man who doesn't ask for what he wants is either very patient or very afraid. Which one are you? Adeline went still. Silas held Thomas's gaze without hesitation. "Both at different times," he said. "I was afraid for a long time. I told myself it was patience. And now? Now I'm trying to be honest about the difference." He turned his coffee cup. "I'm not going to tell you I'm the right choice for your daughter, Mr. Mercer. That's not my call. But I will tell you that I have not pushed her toward anything. I have not used her grief or her situation or her distance from home to my advantage, and I don't intend to." He paused. "The choice she makes is going to be hers, whatever it is." Thomas was quiet for a long time. The wind came through the porch from the south, warmer than yesterday, and somewhere in the eastern pasture a meadowlark started and stopped. "When my wife was dying," Thomas said slowly, as if testing the ground, "I made every decision I could make. About the doctors, the house, the arrangements, about Adeline's life, her future, her grief." He stopped. Started again. "I told myself I was holding things together, that somebody had to." Silas said nothing. He was listening with his whole face. "I've been holding things together for 3 years," Thomas said, "including things that didn't need holding. Including a 24-year-old woman with a perfectly functional mind who stopped asking me for things because she learned I was going to manage whatever she brought me." "Dad," Adeline said, "let me finish." He looked at his coffee. "I saw it in your letter. Not what you wrote, the way you wrote it. Clear and direct and not asking for anything from me, just telling me what was true. Your mother used to write to me like that before we married." He glanced up at her. "I didn't realize you'd stopped doing it until it came back." She didn't trust herself to speak. The back of her throat was doing something inconvenient. Thomas looked at Silas. "I came here expecting a problem," he said. "I thought I was coming to correct a situation." "I know," Silas said, without judgment. "What I'm looking at is a man who built something real over a long time, alone, and kept it when it would have been easier not to." Thomas glanced at the char line in the east pasture. "And from what Adeline tells me, he stood in the middle of it last night and didn't back down." "Neither did she," Silas said. Thomas looked at his daughter. Something in his face was doing the thing it hadn't done in 3 years. Moving, actually moving, instead of holding a careful shape. "No," he said. "I suppose she didn't." It was not the sudden softening of a man who had been wrong and was now completely right. Thomas Mercer was too particular a person for that. But something shifted in him, visibly, the way weight shifts when something is set down. Not a transformation, just a redistribution, the body finding a new center. "I'd like to see the place," he said to Silas. "If that's all right." Silas stood. "Come on." They walked the ranch, the 3 of them, starting with the barn and the corral, and working out along the fence line toward the creek. Thomas asked questions that were less about assessing and more about understanding, a distinction Adeline noticed and didn't comment on. Silas answered in the straightforward way he answered everything. At the creek they stood for a while, watching the water move. Thomas said, "Adeline told me about the room." Silas was still. "She didn't tell me details," Thomas said, "just that there was one, that it had been locked for a long time." He paused. "She said you opened it." "2 nights ago," Silas said. "That's not nothing," Thomas said. He was not looking at Silas when he said it, but at the water. "I've got rooms like that too. Not actual rooms, but the kind you build to put something in so you don't have to look at it every day. He paused. I've been living in mine for 3 years and calling it strength. Silas said nothing. My wife she was a direct person, Thomas said, and his voice had changed, gone rougher with the thing underneath. She would have told me in clear language what I was doing wrong. She'd have said, Thomas, you're managing the world instead of living in it, and you're taking our daughter down with you, and you need to stop. He stopped. She would have been right. A hawk moved over the creek in a long glide and was gone. She sounds like she was worth grieving properly, Silas said. Thomas looked at him. The expression on his face was complicated and brief, and then he looked away again. She was, he said. She was worth a lot of things I didn't do right. They stood at the creek for a while longer and then turned back toward the ranch. The afternoon light was going golden, and the mountains to the west were showing the first suggestion of their coming winter color, and everything was very quiet in the way that Wyoming went quiet when the wind stopped, a quiet that had actual weight to it. On the porch, before he left, Thomas stood with his hat in his hand and looked at Silas the way a man looks at something he's still deciding how to understand. I'm not going to say you have my blessing, he said. I don't think that's the kind of thing I have the right to give or withhold at this point. I wasn't expecting it, Silas said. What I'm saying is, Thomas looked at his hat. I came here to fix something, and what I found is that the thing I thought was broken isn't. He looked up. That's an uncomfortable thing to find when you've traveled a long way to fix it, Silas said. I know that feeling. Thomas put his hat on. I'd like to have dinner with my daughter tonight, without the hotel food if your aunt has any options, Adeline. Clara will have opinions, Adeline said. Good, he said. I could use someone else's opinions for a change. He went back across the yard to where his horse was tied, and managed the mounting with slightly more grace than the dismounting had suggested, and rode out toward the creek road without looking back, which was a Mercer family trait. Adeline and Silas stood on the porch and watched him go. He's not an easy man, she said. No, Silas agreed, but he's trying. You can see him trying. I've never seen him try before, she said. He usually just does. Maybe the trying is new. She thought about that. About her mother's letters, the ones Thomas had mentioned. About a man who had been managing for 3 years and was perhaps only now realizing what managing had cost. She understood it. She was in some ways her father's daughter, and understanding it made it both more forgivable and more sad. Silas, she said. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, and I need to say it plainly, the way you said things should be said, with the actual words and not just the evidence. He was very still. I'm not staying in Wyoming because I fell in love with the landscape, she said. I'm not staying because I was lonely, or because I needed to prove something to my father, or to Martha Crowley, or to anyone. She looked at him directly. I'm staying because when I am here, I am most fully myself. And when I think about leaving, what I feel isn't relief or freedom. It's loss. She paused. And you are the largest part of what I would be losing. The silence that followed was different from the other silences of the summer. It was not the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill space. It was the silence of something that has been held back for a long time and has just been released, and everyone present is adjusting to the new pressure. Silas looked at her for a long moment. His hands were at his sides. He did not look away. I told myself, he said slowly, that I wasn't going to do this, that I wasn't going to be the thing that asked you to give up. I'm not giving anything up, she said. I'm choosing something. There's a difference, and I need you to let me have it. He stopped. I'm choosing this, she said. I'm choosing the ranch, and the creek, and the sideways wind, and I'm choosing you. With clear eyes, full information, and no one's hands on my back pushing me here. She held his gaze. So the question is what you're choosing. He looked at her for so long that she began to feel the particular vulnerability of having said the true thing and waiting for the true thing back. Then he said, I've been choosing you since the 3rd Saturday you came out here to help with a fence you didn't need to fix. He said it simply, without decoration, in the way of a man who had been waiting a long time to be able to mean something. I've been trying to do it quietly enough not to be a pressure on you. I know, she said. I know you were, but I don't need quiet anymore. I need the actual thing. The actual thing, he repeated. Yes. He exhaled, long and slow, and something that had been held in him for, not just this summer, longer, much longer, seemed to go with it. All right, he said. She looked at him. That's all? All right? The almost laugh came all the way through. Real, full, unhurried. It changed everything about his face. What do you want me to say? Something with more words in it. I love you, he said. Is that enough words? She felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real heat after a long cold morning. It's the right number, she said. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just the practical, careful way he did everything, fingers wrapping around hers with the same steadiness he'd used to hold the roan that first day she'd seen him work. They stood on the porch of the ranch while the afternoon light moved through its last gold hour, and the wind came soft from the south, and across the eastern pasture the burned grass lay flat and dark, and waiting for the rain that would come in October, the way it always came, turning what had been scorched back into something that could hold seed. Inside the house, at the end of this hallway, the door to the nursery stood open. The air moved through it freely now, the way air moves through any room that has finally been allowed to breathe. Adeline looked at the house, at the open door visible through the window, and thought about what Silas had said the night he unlocked it, that he needed it to be a room again, not a monument. She thought about what a room needed to become a room again after being something else for so long. It needed light, it needed air, it needed someone to walk through it with intention rather than avoidance. It needed, eventually, to be filled with something other than what it had been keeping. She didn't say any of that. She just held his hand on the porch of the ranch in the last of the afternoon light and thought about the difference between a future that is planned for you and a future you build yourself, and how the building is harder and the result less certain, and the whole enterprise worth every difficult, imperfect, real moment of it. Somewhere toward town, her father was riding along the creek road thinking about rooms of his own. The sun moved behind the mountains. The shadows came long across the pasture, and the horses at the creek lifted their heads and moved toward the barn with the unhurried certainty of animals that know where they belong. And the evening came down over Wyoming the way it always did, big and quiet, and making no promises about tomorrow, which was, Adeline had come to understand, not indifference but honesty. She could live with honesty. She could build something in it. Thomas Mercer stayed in Red Creek for 6 days. He had planned for 3. He extended without announcement, which was not like him, and did not explain the extension, which was also not like him, but which Adeline understood to mean that he was doing something he didn't have language for yet and needed more time to do it in. On the 2nd day, he had dinner at Clara's house, and Clara fed him roasted chicken and talked to him in the direct way she talked to everyone, and by the end of the evening, the two of them were arguing companionably about the best way to manage a property with limited water rights, which was not a conversation Adeline had anticipated, but which seemed to do something useful for her father, give him solid ground to stand on while he worked out the softer things. On the 3rd day, he went back to the ranch with Adeline, not because she asked him to, but because he appeared at Clara's door in the morning with his hat on and said he'd thought of some questions about the eastern pasture damage. The questions were real questions, which she appreciated. He wanted to understand the fire properly, not to assign blame, though that was part of it, but because Thomas Mercer processed feeling through information and the fire had given him a great deal to feel. Silas answered the questions at the fence line, walking Thomas through the burn pattern and where the fire had originated and how fast it had moved. He showed him the origin point, the patch of ground near the south road where the grass had burned first and hottest, where the evidence of the lanterns was still readable if you knew how to look. Thomas stood there and looked at it for a long time. These men, he said, Reader and the others, are they going to face anything for this? The sheriff has been out, Silas said. He's deciding. He said it without heat. It's complicated because they didn't intend to start a fire. They were trespassing and they were carrying lanterns in dry grass, but intent matters in law. Intent matters everywhere, Thomas said, until someone loses their barn. I didn't lose the barn. You nearly did. Silas looked at the burn line. Nearly's not the same as did. Thomas looked at him. You're not angry about it. I'm angry, Silas said. I'm just not planning to carry it as the main thing. He picked up a piece of charred grass and turned it in his hand. If I carried every wrong thing this town has done toward me as the main thing, I'd have been carrying a full load for 20 years. There's no working like that. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's a kind of patience I don't have. It's not patience, Silas said. It's just knowing what the work needs. The work doesn't care how angry I am. The grass needs to grow back either way. They walked back from the burn line, and Adeline walked slightly behind them and let them have the space of it. She had been watching her father in these interactions with the particular attention of a person who knows someone very well and has seen something new in them, something that had perhaps always been possible but had needed the right conditions. He was listening, not preparing his next point, not organizing what he'd already heard into a response, actually listening, the way people listen when they've decided the other person might have something worth hearing. It was not a transformation. She was suspicious of transformations. But it was a shift, and shifts were real. That evening, sitting on Clara's porch in the early dark, Thomas said to Adeline, "He's a man who built something when he had every reason not to, and then kept building when the first thing he built it for was gone." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand that better than I thought I would." "I know you do," she said. He looked at her. "Your mother built things too. After the first miscarriage, before you, she just kept building. A life. Our life." He stopped. The roughness was back in his voice, the one that came when he got close to the real thing. "I've been trying to maintain that life since she died. Like maintenance was the same as building." Adeline said nothing. She let it sit. "It's not the same," he said. "Maintenance and building. I think I've known that for a while and didn't want to say it." "No," she agreed. "They're not the same." He nodded slowly. The dark had come down fully now, and the stars were out over Wyoming in their comprehensive way, thick and bright in a sky with no city to compete with them. "I'm going home Saturday," he said. "I've been away from the house long enough." He paused. "I'm going to write you letters, not the kind I've been writing, different ones." "I'd like that," she said. "And I'd like to come back in the spring," he said. If there's reason to come back." She looked at him. "There's reason," she said. He nodded. Something in him settled, the way things settle when they've been confirmed rather than assumed. "All right," he said. The truth about the fire finished coming out over the following 2 weeks, the way truths come out in small towns. Not in one clean statement, but in pieces, each piece carried by a different person until the whole shape became visible. It was Pete who brought the first piece to the town's attention, in the direct manner of a man who had decided that silence was no longer the right tool. He spoke at the counter of Dawson's General Store on a Monday morning when 6 people were present, and he said what he knew, that he had heard Holt Reeder and the others talking at the hotel, that he had not acted on it when he should have, and that he believed the community needed to understand what had actually happened on the night of the fire before it built any more stories on top of the false foundations already in place. The livery boy, his name was Cal, Adeline had learned, 17 years old and sharper than he let on, told what he had seen from the South Road that morning. 3 men, lanterns, heading east toward Grangerland before the fire started. A woman from the north, the one who had arrived to help fight the fire without introduction, and whose name turned out to be Ruth Haskell, told what she had seen when she arrived at the ranch. Silas and Adeline and Pete already working, the bucket line, the wet blankets, the close margin by which the barn had been saved. Holt Reeder came to the sheriff's office on his own on the Wednesday of the 2nd week. He sat down across from Sheriff Briggs and said that the fire had started from a lantern that he had been carrying. He said it had not been intentional. He said that what had been intentional was going to that land to make a point, and that the point had been based on a story that had turned out not to be the story he thought it was. The sheriff asked him what he meant. Holt said that he had believed Silas Granger to be a man with something to hide, and that he had believed the girl from Illinois was in a situation that required intervention, and that he had found out in the most damaging possible way that neither of those things was true. He said he was not sure what the legal consequences were for what he'd done, and he was prepared for them. But he also said he wanted to go out to the Granger ranch and say this to Silas directly, if Silas would allow it. Silas allowed it. The conversation happened on a Thursday morning in the yard, which was where significant things at the ranch seemed to happen. Holt arrived on his own, without Carver or Drummond, and he stood in the yard with his hat off, and he said what he had said to the sheriff, more or less, with slightly more difficulty. Silas listened without interrupting. When Holt was done, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. The east fence line cost me 4 days of work, Silas said. The east pasture grass will take a full season to come back. I had a horse with scratches from running the creek bank at night in the dark. He paused. And I had men from this community decide they understood my life well enough to take action on it, which they didn't and don't. Holt said nothing. I'm not going to tell you it was all right, Silas said. It wasn't. He looked at Holt directly. But I'm also not going to carry it forward as a permanent account. I've got too much work to be that man. He put his hat on. The fence help I'll accept. The apology I've heard. We can move from here. Holt looked like a man who had expected worse and was not sure the not worse was better or harder than the worse would have been. All right, he said. He put his own hat on. I'll bring Carver and Drummond out Saturday for the fence work. We'll stay out of your way otherwise. Saturday's fine, Silas said. Holt rode out. Adeline, who had watched from the porch, came down into the yard when he was gone. You didn't have to be that fair, she said. I know, Silas said. But he came out here and said the thing. Most people never actually say the thing. He looked toward the east pasture. That's worth something. What happened in Red Creek after that was not a dramatic public redemption. Small towns don't work like that. They don't reverse course cleanly or acknowledge errors in organized ways. What they do instead is shift, incrementally, imperfectly, with setbacks and resistances, and people who never quite change their minds but stop saying the things they had been saying because the air has changed around those things. Martha Crowley did not apologize. Adeline had not expected her to. But she stopped speaking about Silas in the particular way she had been speaking, and when his name came up in conversation, she spoke about him in the flat neutral of someone who has revised a position without wanting to admit the revision. It was not grace, but it was movement. Other people moved differently. Ruth Haskell, who had shown up without introduction to fight a fire on a stranger's land, became something close to a regular presence at the ranch. She had opinions about how to improve the water routing through the south pasture and was not shy about sharing them, and Silas listened to her with the same directness he listened to everyone he respected. Cal from the livery started appearing on Saturday mornings with a willingness to work that he traded for Silas's occasional instruction on horsemanship, a transaction that suited both parties. The town did not become a different town, but within it, some things rearranged. In the nursery, Adeline and Silas worked slowly. It was not a single afternoon's project. It took weeks, partly because they were both busy with the actual work of the ranch, and partly because the room deserved to be approached without hurry, as something that had waited a long time and could wait a little longer for the right attention. They cleared the shelf first, the small carved horse, the tin rattle, the blanket. Silas handled each one briefly and set it in a box without ceremony, without narrating what he was feeling, and she let him have that private. The box went to the back of the barn, not thrown away, just held somewhere at a proper distance. The letters were last. He held them for a long time one evening, sitting on the floor of the almost empty room while Adeline sat across from him and the lamp threw warm light across the walls. He didn't open them. He turned the tied bundle in his hands, feeling the weight and the age of them. The ribbon faded past any original color. I'm not going to read them, he said finally. She waited. I know what they say, he said. I know the main thing. Everything else in them is just the shape of someone trying to explain an explanation. He set the bundle on the floor between them. I don't need the explanation anymore. What do you need? She asked. He thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, the way he did things. Without performance, without rushing toward the answer. To burn them, he said. Not because I'm angry. Just because keeping them is keeping a door open that doesn't need to be open. He looked up. Does that seem? It seems right, she said. It seems like something you should do. They burned them in the yard that night, in the fire ring he used for burning brush. Just the two of them, and the quiet, and the fire doing its clean work. The ribbon caught first, and then the paper, and Silas stood and watched without speaking, and she stood beside him and did the same. It took about 4 minutes. When it was done, he kicked a little dirt over the embers in a practical way, and they went back inside. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. The room took shape slowly over the following weeks. She brought books from Clara's overflowing shelves. Her aunt was a reader of comprehensive and unsystematic appetites, with stacks on every surface and boxes in every corner, and was delighted to contribute. Adeline arranged them on the cleared shelves with the particular pleasure of a schoolteacher given a space to fill with things she loved. A reading chair came from the hotel, which was replacing its furniture and selling the old pieces. 2 lamps, a small table, a braided rug that Ruth Haskell turned up with one morning, saying she'd made it 2 winters ago, and it was too big for where she'd intended it, the cradle they kept. That surprised her when she thought about it, but it didn't surprise her when they were standing in the room deciding. Silas looked at it for a long moment and said, "I built that. It's well made. It doesn't have to mean the same thing it meant." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it doesn't." It went to the corner of the room, not as a centerpiece, not as a statement, just a well-made thing in a room full of things chosen with care. It became, in time, one of those objects that visitors noticed and then didn't remark on, because it sat so naturally in the space that asking about it would have felt like asking about the floorboards. Thomas Mercer's letters came differently than they had before. He was not a natural letter writer. He was a man of organized thought and practical action, and the written word didn't come easily to him. But he wrote, and what he wrote was not managed or structured the way his earlier letters had been. He wrote about the house and the weather, yes, but he also wrote about his wife. Small things. The way she had kept her gardening tools, the specific sound of her in the kitchen on winter mornings, a joke she had told him in the 2nd year of their marriage that he still thought about when the weather turned cold. He wrote these things without preamble or explanation, as if they had been sitting in him long enough and had found a way out. Adeline wrote back in kind. She told him about the ranch in detail. Not the romantic details, but the real ones. The mud and the cold and the equipment that broke at inconvenient times, and the particular difficulty of keeping a wood stove running through a Wyoming night. She told him about Silas, carefully, in the way you write about someone when you want the other person to actually see them. She told him about the reading room and the books and the chair. She told him about the cradle in one letter, briefly. She wrote, "He kept it because he made it well, and it doesn't have to be only one thing. I think most things are like that." Thomas wrote back, "Your mother would have said exactly that. It was the closest he had come to saying he thought she'd done right." She kept the letter. Winter in Wyoming arrived without politeness. It came hard in the 2nd week of November, the temperature dropping 40 degrees over 3 days, and the first real snow following immediately behind. And Adeline understood with her body what she had only understood with her mind before, that the frontier required different things from a person than the life she had come from. It required the physical fact of preparation, of understanding that warmth and food and safety in a Wyoming winter were things you made, not things that happened to you, and that the work of summer and fall was not separate from comfort in February, but continuous with it. She was not always good at it. She burned things on the stove, sometimes from distraction, and sometimes from genuine misunderstanding of how the heat distributed. She misjudged distances between buildings in the dark and cold, in ways that were sometimes merely inconvenient and once nearly serious. She had opinions about how things should be organized that did not always align with the way Silas had been organizing them for 20 years, and they argued about this, not badly, but actually argued, the way people argue when they're both certain and both willing to find the third thing. "The feed bins," she said one morning in January, standing in the barn with cold breath visible in the air. "If they were on the south wall, they'd be easier to access from the corral." "The south wall has the drainage problem in spring," he said. "Then we fix the drainage." "The drainage requires—" He stopped, looked at the wall, looked at the bins. "That's not a bad point." "I know it's not." "You could have more grace about being right." "I could," she agreed pleasantly, and he almost laughed, which had become by then a regular sound in the barn and the house and on the porch, and which she never stopped finding remarkable. They moved the bins in March, after fixing the drainage, and the new arrangement was better, and she did not say so more than twice. Spring came the way it always came in Wyoming, reluctantly, in pieces, with frost returning whenever it felt like it, and the warmth advancing in negotiations rather than declarations. The burned grass in the east pasture began its return in April, first as a faint general greening, and then as specific blades coming up through the charred earth, tentative and then less tentative and then simply growing, as grass grows, without regard for what had come before it. Holt Reeder and Carver had come out in the fall with tools and spent 2 Saturdays repairing fence line, working in the practical quiet of men who are paying a debt without words. The sheriff had decided that the incident was prosecutable as negligent trespass and had left it to Silas to pursue or not. Silas had not pursued it. The decision made some people in town think he was too easy, and some think he was wise, and some simply noted it and moved on, which was the full range of responses he'd anticipated and had made peace with before making the decision. Drummond, the older man, had come to the ranch alone one afternoon in October. He had not come to help with fence work or to apologize exactly. He was not that kind of man. He had come to bring Silas a map of the South Pasture water flow that he'd drawn up based on 40 years of working adjacent land, and he said simply that it might be useful. Silas had taken it and thanked him, and they had spoken for an hour about water management and drainage and the particular difficulty of the county's soil in wet springs. And that had been that. People are not always capable of the large gesture. Sometimes they offer what they have, which is information about drainage, and sometimes that has to be enough. Thomas came back in May, as he had promised. He arrived on the same platform where Adeline had stood in the previous September, and got off the train with more ease than the first time. Not comfortable exactly with travel, but less organized about it. He looked, she thought, slightly less managed. His hair was still gray and his lines were still deep, but something in the way he held himself had shifted a fraction towards something looser. He stayed for 10 days. He spent most of them at the ranch, working where he was useful and staying out of the way where he wasn't. And by the 4th day, he and Silas had fallen into a kind of parallel working relationship. Not friendship yet, which would take more time and might always have an edge to it, but mutual recognition, which was its own substantial thing. On his 7th day, Thomas found the reading room. He hadn't been in the house much. He was a careful guest that way, respecting boundaries without being told where they were. But Silas had said to Adeline that it was all right, that the house was not a place he was keeping closed anymore, and she had taken her father through it one evening after supper. Thomas stood in the reading room doorway and looked at it. The books, the chair, the lamps, the braided rug, the cradle in the corner. He didn't say anything for a while. "She made it," he said finally. Meaning Adeline, meaning the room, meaning what had been done with a space that had been closed. "We both did," she said. He looked at the cradle. She watched him look at it and let him. "Your mother did something like this," he said. Before you. There was a room. She changed it. She didn't make it pretend nothing had happened. She just changed what it was for." He was quiet. "I'd forgotten that. I'd completely forgotten it until right now." Adeline didn't speak. "She was good at that," he said, "changing what a thing was for without pretending it was never something else." He turned away from the room, and she saw that his eyes were doing the thing they did when he was managing, and she thought about saying, "Let it go," and decided not to, because Thomas Mercer would let it go in his own time and his own way, and she was done managing that any more than he should manage her. "Come sit on the porch," she said. "Silas is making coffee." He nodded. He looked at the room once more. "It's a good room," he said. "It is now," she agreed. The wedding was in the following June, which gave both of them a full year from the day in the yard when the words had finally been said. Neither of them had been in a hurry, which people found puzzling, but the truth was simpler than puzzling. They were already living in the thing, already building it, and the ceremony was not the beginning of the life, but the public acknowledgement of a life already underway. Clara stood on one side and Pete Alcott on the other. Thomas Mercer stood where a father stands, and he did it with the particular dignity of a man who has been wrong and has decided the most useful thing he can do about that is show up fully for what comes after. Ruth Haskell came with the young man Cal, who had continued his Saturday education in horsemanship and had become, over the months, one of the more capable young riders in the county. Holt Reeder came with his wife and stood toward the back, which was the appropriate distance, and stayed for the meal, which was the appropriate gesture. Martha Crowley sent flowers, which arrived without a note, which was either oversight or restraint, and Adeline chose to believe the more generous interpretation. It was not a large ceremony. It was not a perfect one. The day was windy, which was Wyoming being itself, and one of the borrowed chairs collapsed during the meal and spilled a man named Henderson and his plate of food into the grass, which was undignified and extremely funny. The cake Clara had made was dense in a way that Clara acknowledged was a failure of eggs and did not try to excuse. Silas, standing next to Adeline in the yard of the ranch with the wind in her hair and the summer light coming down over the hills, said his words in the straightforward way he said everything that mattered, without performance, without flourish, with the complete attention of a man who was present in the way some people never managed to be. She said hers the same way. What she thought about, in the moment after, was not the romance of it or the ceremony of it. She thought about a locked door and a worn key and what it costs a person to keep something locked and what it means to finally open it. Not because someone forced you, not because the alternative became impossible, but because you chose to. Because you looked at the lock and the key and the closed thing behind the door and decided that whatever was in there was better off in the air. That was the thing, she thought. That was what she had come to Wyoming for, even though she hadn't known it when she came. Not the man, not the ranch, not even the life she was choosing, though all of those were real and all of them mattered. What she had needed was to watch someone choose to open a locked door and then walk through it, and to learn from that watching that the door she'd been managing for her own life could be opened too. That the thing behind it was not only loss but also possibility. That a room could become a different room if you let it breathe. Her father, watching from across the yard, had been learning something parallel. She could see it in him. The gradual loosening of the organized grief. The returning willingness to let things be what they were instead of what he needed them to be. It would not be complete or permanent. Some rooms in a person take a lifetime and still end up only half open. But half open is not the same as locked, and the difference matters. She had written that to him once, in a letter, carefully. Half open is not the same as locked. He had not responded directly to it, but in his next letter he had mentioned her mother 3 times, easy and natural, like talking about someone who had existed in his life rather than someone he was maintaining in amber. 2 rocking chairs appeared on the porch the summer after the wedding. This was not a romantic gesture, so one had been on the porch already, Silas's, and Adeline had simply brought out the one from the reading room that she preferred for her own purposes, and they had both simply stayed. Visitors who came in later years noticed the 2 chairs as a pleasant detail. The people who had been there from the beginning understood that the 2 chairs had different histories and had ended up in the same place, which was how most things that lasted actually happened. The reading room filled in further over time. More books, naturally, because Adeline was a school teacher who had stopped teaching in a formal classroom but had not stopped being someone for whom books were as necessary as weather. Clara's overflow, continued donations from the county, and eventually books she ordered specifically, building a collection with intention. She began to hold informal reading evenings, once a month, for anyone in the county who wanted to come, which some people did and some didn't, and which were neither a grand success nor a failure. Just a thing that existed and was useful for the people for whom it was useful. Cal came. Ruth Haskell came, usually with her own book, which she read instead of listening and which no one minded. Thomas, when he visited, sat in the reading chair with his hat on his knee and sometimes stayed after everyone else had gone and read until the fire needed banking, and those evenings Adeline left him there and went to bed and felt something she could only name as right. The east pasture came back fully in the second spring. Grass grows if you let it, which is one of those things that sounds obvious until you've watched a burned field in October and February and March, and still believed in April. Silas reseeded the worst sections and left the rest alone because grass mostly knows what to do if you stop disturbing it, which was a principle he applied to most things. There was no single day when Red Creek finished adjusting to the Grangers. It was not that kind of adjustment. What happened was smaller and more durable. The town became, over time, familiar with the reality of them, which replaced the story it had been telling, and familiar is its own kind of acceptance even when it falls short of warmth. People have asked, over the years, what the lesson is. As if a life can be reduced to a lesson. As if the whole complicated, imperfect, occasionally magnificent thing can be folded down into something that fits on a page. Adeline had opinions about this, as she had opinions about most things, and Silas had his, and they did not always agree. What she believed was this, that most locked rooms are not hiding terrible things. They are hiding wounds that were sealed before they could heal, and the sealing made sense at the time, and the problem is not that you sealed them, but that you forgot to check whether they were still necessary. That the check itself is frightening, because what if the thing inside is still as raw as the day you closed the door? But also, and this was the part that cost her something to believe because it required trusting the uncertain, what if it isn't? What if time has done work in there, even in the dark, even unattended, and what's inside is no longer the same weight it was? You don't know until you open it. And you cannot open it if you have thrown away the key, or if you have given the key to someone else to manage, or if you have convinced yourself that the room does not matter as long as the rest of the house is livable. Silas had carried the key in his pocket for 22 years. That was both the failure and the grace of it. The failure because he'd waited so long, the grace because he hadn't thrown it away. He'd kept it. Even when keeping it hurt, even when opening the thing it opened seemed impossible, he'd carried it on him, worn smooth with years. That was worth something. That was maybe everything. On the porch in the evenings, when the work was done and the horses were settled and the light came down long across the Wyoming hills, the two of them sat in their separate chairs and were quiet, in the particular way of people who have enough between them that silence does not need to be filled. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they read. Sometimes one of them fell asleep in the chair and the other put a blanket over them and went inside without waking them, which was a form of love that required no words and made no demands, and was simply, entirely, there. The wind came through the valley the way it always had and always would, sideways, indifferent, making the grass move in patterns no one had named. The mountains held their positions. The creek ran its course. The door at the end of the hallway stood open. Not dramatic, not symbolic, just open, the way a door stands when the room beyond it is in use, when someone has walked through it recently and will walk through it again, when it is no longer the boundary between what is kept and what is lived, but simply a door in a house full of people doing their imperfect, ordinary, valuable best to be alive in the same place at the same time, which is, in the end, what any of us are trying to do, which is enough.